We are conditioned to fear the national debt clock. These numbers are framed as an immense weight, a bill we irresponsibly pass to future generations. This fear relies on the household metaphor. It assumes the government is just like a family. If it spends more than it earns, it has to go out and borrow the difference from the private sector by selling Treasury bonds. But for a government that issues its own currency in a pure fiat system, that assumption is a total inversion of reality. These governments do not need to borrow their own money before they can spend it. Treasury bonds don't actually fund the government. They are a mechanical leftover from a financial system that hasn't existed for decades. To see why the bond market has become obsolete, we have to trace its development through 3 distinct stages of economic history. In each era, we need to ask what specific mechanical problem the Treasury bond was trying to solve and identify the exact moment it disappeared. Mapping this history allows us to dismantle the debt myth and clearly see what our economy is actually capable of achieving. Under the gold standard, a nation's currency was a physical claim on a finite commodity. Because the government committed to swapping cash for gold, it could actually run out of money. If the government spent too much into the economy, citizens could exchange those extra paper notes for gold, threatening to drain the nation's physical reserves. Treasury bonds solved this. By selling bonds, the government drained that excess currency out of the public's hands, protecting the gold supply. In this era, bonds were a necessary defense. They functioned as a literal shield against sovereign bankruptcy. Without a gold peg, a new mechanical issue emerged. Deficit spending flooded banks with cash reserves. If those reserves became too plentiful, the interest rates banks charged each other would drop to zero, stripping the central bank of its control. Central banks repurposed the Treasury bond to act as a sponge. They auctioned them off to soak up those excess reserves, keeping cash scarce enough to pull interest rates back up to their target. The bond market survived the end of the gold standard, but its core function evolved. It now served as a monetary thermostat, used to control interest rates by managing the supply of reserves. The final justification for the bond market dissolved in the early 2000s, when central banks began paying interest directly on bank reserves. This policy change meant central banks could control interest rates directly, just by changing the rate they paid on those reserves. The mechanical need to use bonds to drain cash vanished. Critics still argue that we need the bond market because financial institutions require safe, risk-free assets for use as collateral. But even this can be handled without a national debt. The central bank could simply issue tradable term deposits, providing the same safety and collateral without the misleading label of government borrowing. Having lost its utility in both protecting gold and controlling interest rates, the Treasury bond market has become a mechanical relic. If the bond market serves no funding or monetary purpose, we must investigate why politicians and the media defend it so fiercely. It persists primarily as a psychological weapon. It frames government investment as a burden, providing a convenient excuse to enforce austerity and limit public spending. In reality, the national debt is just a record of every dollar the government has spent into the economy that hasn't been taxed back yet. It is the literal definition of the private sector's net savings. Historical records once relied on notched pieces of wood called tally sticks. In a modern fiat system, the Treasury bond is just as much of an artifact. We can choose to phase out the Treasury bond market entirely. This allows us to build an economy constrained by our actual labor and resources rather than the phantom of a debt burden.